However, the immediate impact will be absolutely nothing. Nothing will change. When you wake up on the day after the in-out referendum and we have a result, nothing's going to happen. There's going to be a long period of negotiations, planning, working out exactly how it's all going to play out. The 2-year period, the 2-year notice period for the EU will probably be extended because there is such a mammoth quantity of law to work through and all the implications to be considered. The following models, the models up on the screen, are the most likely potential outcomes of those negotiations. The first one being EEA, or European Economic Area, and EFTA, or European Free Trade Association, membership. The UK could join the EEA and EFTA with continued access to the EU market, but the government has already stated that this is not a preferred option, and that is probably because it's a model that has been followed by other countries. Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein are all members of both of these organisations, and they're obliged to accept the majority of EU regulations without having much say or material influence as to what those regulations look like. They do have a reduced contribution to the EU budget, but quid pro quo, they don't get much say in what the legislation coming out of the EU is going to look like. So the second option is bilateral agreements, and this is the option that Switzerland has. And it's something that the FCA has actually said is a model that could work. So the UK could agree a set of bilateral agreements to gain access to the single market. But this would be cumbersome and complex, and I don't think it would be an option that the EU would favour. Switzerland, as I said, is a member of EFTA with 120 bilateral accords and trade treaties with the EU, 120. And it has to contribute to the EU budget, and it's still carving out that relationship after 7 years. So, that's a cumbersome option to go for. The third option is customs union, which is the option that Turkey, Andorra, and San Marino have gone for, but they have little power in shaping policy either. The fourth option, free trade agreements. The UK could agree individual free trade agreements with the EU in different areas, but this depends on what the EU would require in return in the negotiations. What would be the quid pro quo there? For example, some free movement of people in return for free movement of goods. That would be something that would need to be negotiated and, again, could be time-consuming and potentially quite controversial within the UK. The fifth option is to rely on existing World Trade Organization rules. That would mean that there wouldn't be the time-consuming aspect of the negotiations with the EU, but the UK would lose access to the single market, which would obviously be a major drawback of that option. A realistic scenario would be that the UK government would maintain the status quo and address legal matters individually over time. Since 65% of UK law created since 1993 is influenced by the EU, this would be a mammoth and laborious and time-consuming task. And over the time when all this is being worked out, in practical terms, nothing is going to change. There's going to be this long period of deliberation. The EU has had an extensive impact on many, many areas of UK law, including consumer protection regulation, data protection and intellectual property rights, as well as financial regulation. So let's look a bit more at the financial regulation side of it, since that's what I purport to know about. So what would financial regulation look like after Brexit? Well, a lot would depend on the exact model that we decided to follow and that we were able to agree with the EU. But a number of legislative and regulatory changes are inevitable. Changes will require firms to consider the structure of their businesses, and there's a likely impact on EU passports, which would likely cease to be available. So businesses would have to continue to decide how they would continue to provide services and market their products in other EU states. Regulations would fall away. This sounds exciting and wonderful. Regulations falling away sounds like a liberating sort of experience, but unfortunately it's likely to be very problematic. From a financial services regulatory perspective, disengaging from the EU would have been a lot more straightforward before the financial crisis. Since 2008, there's been a big increase in the regulatory burden from the EU in legislation dealing with the financial services sector. There has also been a move away from directives which oblige member states to implement directives in their own national law to regulations which are directly applicable. So when there's a Brexit vote, if there's a Brexit vote, not suggesting that there will be a Brexit vote, I'm maintaining strict impartiality here. If there is a Brexit vote, those regulations would fall away. The directly applicable EU regulations would fall away, leaving a vacuum. The EU would lack equivalent rules, which would cause problems for firms wishing to access the EU markets. The most obvious place where this is going to have an effect is in authorisations and passports. And since the financial crisis, a core tenet of the EU model for financial services has been that firms need to be authorised in member states. And the conditions of authorisation impose a number of obligations, such as operational and transparency obligations on firms, regardless of which member state they are authorised in. And those requirements and the authorisation are a prerequisite to operating in other member states. So once authorised in one member state, a firm can passport its services across the EU to other member states. This has obvious benefits commercially for European Union firms. There are a range of passports available under EU directives, and the most widely used are the Insurance Mediation Directive, IMD, the Markets in Financial Instruments Directives, MiFID, the Undertakings for Collective Investment in Transferable Securities Directives, UCITS, and the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, or the AIFMD. I'm not going to go into, you'll be pleased to hear, the ramifications under each one of those directives, because it would take me all evening, frankly, just to keep saying their names. But suffice it to say that in the event of Brexit, UK firms will no longer benefit from the passporting regime. Unless the UK negotiates membership of the EEA, which the government has stated is not a preferred option, UK firms will no longer be able to provide services cross-border or establish branches under relevant passports. New licenses are likely to be required from host regulators in other member states, and networks of branches in the EU may need to be restructured. This is going to have widespread implications for financial services firms operating in the EU. The UK may be able to create a lighter regulatory regime when the European regulations fall away, but they would have to have a parallel regime which firms wishing to operate in the EU would opt into. So if you are a UK-based financial services firm and you wanted to market your services in the EU, you would need to opt into this parallel regime which the UK would create to hopefully be deemed to be equivalent to EU legislation. So in practice, if you wanted to operate in the EU, then you would have to abide by EU legislation in any case. There's no two ways about it. But if you wanted to operate solely in the UK, then you would have the benefit of a lighter regulatory regime. There would also be significant effects felt in relation to EMIR, which is the regulation on over-the-counter derivative transactions, central counterparties, and trade repositories. And it chiefly affects clearinghouses. London has some of the world's largest clearinghouses, as I'm sure you know, and a UK clearinghouse authorised by the Bank of England under the process set out in EMIR can provide clearing services to clearing members and trading venues in the EU. That's the benefit of EMIR, and it's similar to the passporting regime for financial services firms. Post-Brexit, however, a UK clearinghouse would likely be deemed a non-EU clearinghouse. Under EMIR, a non-EU clearinghouse must be recognised by ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Authority, before it can provide services to clearing members or trading venues in the EU. This would require, amongst other things, clearinghouses operating in London to apply to ESMA for recognition, the Commission to pass an implementing act on the equivalence of the UK's regime, and relevant cooperation agreements to be in place between the EU and the UK. All of these hurdles are likely to take time to arrange. Given the size and importance of UK clearinghouses, there will have to be an interim solution in the meantime, but what that will be as yet is unclear. A further point to consider is the euro and whether London clearinghouses would be permitted to continue handling significant euro-denominated transactions after Brexit. When the euro was introduced, the original stance of the European Central Bank was to require that all clearinghouses which handle a large volume of euro-denominated trades were based in the eurozone. The UK challenged this successfully, which is, why we have the great London clearinghouses. But following a Brexit, there may be people in Europe who would wish to revisit that decision. So specific to fintech firms, what is the impact of all this going to be? Well, the Treasury has published an analysis on the potential economic impact of Brexit. And I must caveat this by saying that the Treasury is obviously part of the UK government, which is strongly in favour of remaining in the EU. So that's the flavour of all of these points from the Treasury. But these are their points for you to consider. UK firms will find it harder to scale, particularly fintech firms and particularly startups. In the event of Brexit, the loss of passporting rights that I spoke about will restrict the ability of UK-based firms to offer services remotely in the 27 other EU member states. This will make it harder for firms to scale across all the EU markets. It's particularly important for startups because they need to access a large customer base in order to compete with the incumbents in the market. To put some numbers on this, the UK alone has around 65 million people, whereas the EU has 508 million. So there's a fantastic customer base to tap into there. Reuters has reported that 7 in 10 fintech companies they spoke to expressed intentions to move their headquarters out of London if Britain exits, to more favourable destinations like Dublin or Luxembourg. And all 10 fintechs, according to Reuters, said a British exit from the EU was a serious concern for their business. The Treasury has also said that the UK would no longer be attractive as a gateway to Europe, and a big attraction for non-EU firms of basing in London is that it is an entry point for the EU markets. Access to passporting is one of the major reasons that they base themselves in the UK. In the event of Brexit, the UK will no longer provide this advantage of passporting. Fewer foreign firms would come to the UK, goes the Treasury's argument, resulting in decreased foreign investment, which is key to the growth and sustainability of the UK fintech market. Also, there was a recent PwC report on the implications of leaving the EU, which stated that 70 to 100,000 UK financial services jobs could be lost by 2020. The Treasury has also said that the UK would lose influence over EU regulation. Currently, the UK has a substantial influence over EU law. Says the Treasury, we have veto rights as well as about 10% of the MEPs in the European Parliament. So leaving the EU would mean that the UK would lose this influence, lose the ability to ensure that EU and UK regulation are aligned in particular. And this could create problems for firms wishing to operate in the two potentially diverging markets. However, there are those that say that Brexit might be good for fintech. They're few and far between, but they are very passionate. And they say that there could be a big opportunity presented for fintechs because the uncertainty and the potentially increased regulatory burden for incumbents will mean that innovation falls even further down their list of priorities, creating a space for fintechs and fintech startups to jump into the market. Some commentators argue that the EU could also present a benefit if there are smart negotiations based on UK interests and could open access to talent within the fintech ecosystem by easing the immigration of non-EU immigrants. In addition, they argue a demonstrable desire to seek stronger ties outside the union may spur venture capitalists to funnel money into London, as opposed to other fintech hubs. So staying in, there will be implications of staying in. It won't just be the status quo, although, again, status quo for some time. The bookies are saying that the vote is going to be very close, so we should definitely look at what's going to happen if there's a vote to remain. EU member states reached an agreement in February called the New Settlement, so that a vote to remain in the EU will effectively be a vote for the UK's special status under this new settlement. The New Settlement covers 4 main areas. Economic governance. They've said that there can be no discrimination against UK firms due to the fact that the UK is not in the euro. Now, what this is going to look like in practice has yet to be determined, and this will be another aspect of deliberations that will go on after the referendum result. Responsibility for financial stability in the UK will remain in the hands of the Bank of England, the FCA, and other UK entities. And UK taxpayers will not be required to pay for any Eurozone bailouts, which is, all of these lead to certainty, I think, which is always a good basis for London as an economic centre. Second point is competitiveness. The new settlement is to address competitiveness so that there's a reduced regulatory burden on businesses, particularly small businesses. So this is excellent news for fintech. What it will look like in practice, how they are going to reduce this regulatory burden, again, they're yet to say, but this is promising stuff. More focus on extending the single market to bring down barriers to trade within the EU, particularly in digital, again, promising for fintech. And the EU will pursue free trade agreements with the world's most dynamic economies. Again, this all sounds like good stuff. How it will be implemented, we don't know yet. There are also provisions on sovereignty, so the concept of ever closer union will no longer apply in the UK. And welfare and free movement, there will be a series of measures to limit the UK's obligations in relation to benefits provision, for example, to migrants entering the UK. The new settlement is legally binding and irreversible, but the details are as yet unclear. So watch this space, if that is the way the vote goes. So, in conclusion, the vote is only the beginning. Following it, nothing may happen for a while. There'll be these periods of negotiations. But if there is a vote to leave the EU, there'll be potentially wide-ranging legal ramifications. Firms may wish to re-examine any contracts and documentation that you have that refers to European legislation, European legal concepts, or any wording that stems from European directives, regulations. Commentators have stated that the uncertainty surrounding the outcome of Brexit could lead to legal, financial, and commercial uncertainties that last for a decade. In relation to financial services, the role of the City of London as a global centre for business is likely to be affected, not least by the atmosphere of uncertainty. A vote to leave the UK won't bring immediate change, but several years of negotiation and planning. And it may be that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The more the UK pushes for access to the single market, the more the EU may demand that we adhere to existing EU legislation in any case. So we may reach a middle ground that is more like the status quo than people reckon. Any questions?
It's Marcus Kern. What opinion have you got about the impact onto the European structural and investment funding? So all the sort of the funding that's dispersed through the European mechanisms. You know, some of those decisions are already made. Some of those decisions will be made after this. Is this all just going to go put on hold until people decide what to do?
There are going to be a lot of implications for funds, for UCITS funds, undertakings for collective investment in transferable securities. There's going to be ones that have UK managers. There are obviously going to be implications for the fact that they can no longer market those funds in the EU. all those passporting regimes for funds will be under question. The Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, passporting arrangements, and the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive. All of those are going to have to be revisited. The likelihood is, I think, that if there is a vote to leave the EU, then Britain will form an equivalent regulatory regime so that those funds can continue to operate in Europe. But that will obviously take time to legislate and will take time to be recognised by Europe and certified. So there will be a period of limbo and uncertainty, which is what is so unattractive at the moment.
What do you think the likelihood is then of in London there becoming two parallel markets, one of which is compliant with Europe, assuming under Brexit, and another one which is not?
That's certainly one of the options, and perhaps an attractive one for firms that only wish to operate in the UK, that there would be that lighter touch regulation in the event of Brexit. As you rightly point out, to operate in Europe, there would be those increased obligations. So that parallel regime may be something that comes about, and I think that's a fairly likely outcome. Yeah.
Thank you very much.